I'll say this. Run the damn ball. Will ya? That's going to be the theme of this episode. Welcome into the show. This is I'll Say This. I am Chris Castellani. Not the greatest weekend of football in the state of Michigan, depending on who you root for. If you're a Spartan fan, then things were hunky-dory. But I think for the most part, it was a little bit of an underwhelming weekend of football. But as a whole, Detroit sports still remain on the up and up. A good weekend in baseball. We are going to talk a fair amount of Tigers baseball here on this episode. But we are going to start by talking about the now 1-1 Detroit Lions. They suffered a loss at home to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. 2016 was the final. You look at the box score, you look at the raw numbers, and there were a lot of positives. The Lions grossly outgained Tampa Bay. They had over 450 yards of total offense. You had a turnover forced on a Brian Branch interception. You had multiple sacks by one guy. I mean, Aiden Hutchinson with 4.5 sacks, just an unbelievable performance by him as he continues to establish himself as one of the best players in football, period, not just defensive players. But it was the little things that the Lions just weren't able to do that ultimately cost them this game. Red zone opportunities that were wasted. You had a Jared Goff interception. You had to settle for 3 field goals. And you had a horrible clock management error at the end of the first half, which ultimately cost them the game. Let's be real. That's a chip shot for Jake Bates. And you look in the fourth quarter there in that final drive, that would have been a chip shot for Jake Bates as well. That would have won them the game. And Dan Campbell, to his credit, and I think this is his transparency is one of the things that many people like about him. He came out and said that was a coaching error. That was a crucial error. That was on him. And it was. And look, you know, he's a stand-up guy, right? I give the man credit for owning it. It's still a coaching mistake. Like, if this is one, okay. I think the Lions are in good shape, by the way. I want to preface that by saying this. And how I feel about this team actually probably differs than how some other people feel after that loss. Like, I'm kind of blasé about it. And while I never like seeing a loss, I never like seeing my team lose, I think that in some ways, this punch in the mouth was somewhat necessary because this team did not play well enough in the first 2 games to be 2-0. They didn't do enough little things correctly. I feel like this one might humble them a little bit. Now, next week, and we'll talk about it, next week is a much more losable game than it was when we saw it on the schedule coming into the season. But at the same time, look, that is a coaching error. And I think, look, we're at a point now with this Lions team where we have to adjust to a certain extent how we view this coaching staff. Because I think 3 years ago, even 2 years ago, it was, hey, this roster is not very good. What you're getting out of this roster is the best you could possibly get. And we did give Dan Campbell and Ben Johnson and the coaching staff their flowers for probably doing more with less in the first year and a half, 2 years in which they were at the helm here. We're going to point out this Lions roster is great. It's one of the best rosters in football. Yes, you could say there's a hole here or there, but for the most part, a lot of GMs would kill to have this roster, meaning that those little coaching mistakes are going to be amplified. And that was a mistake that ultimately cost them the game. Now, there were other things throughout the game that they could have done a lot better. Jared Goff just seems just not quite 100% there. I don't think it's injury related, but Goff is one of those quarterbacks where you can noticeably tell when he's vibing, when he's in rhythm, when he's feeling himself, and you can tell when he's just not confident. Well, he threw for a lot of yards. He also threw a shit ton of passes. I didn't get the impression that was a particularly confident quarterback on Sunday, and I think a big reason for it, and thus the title of this episode, Run the Damn Ball, the Lions, to their credit, and Dan Campbell deserves a ton of credit for this, they have an identity as a football team. Going out and saying grit and putting it on T-shirts is one thing. Actually establishing your brand of football as a gritty brand of football is another. And the Lions have done that over the last several years. The overtime game in week 1 against Los Angeles was a prime example of that. We have a good O-line. We have good running backs. We are going to run the ball down your throat. I was very surprised on Sunday with the offensive play calling because while I understand Tampa Bay's secondary was a bit banged up, it was surprising to me how early and how often Jared Goff was going back to pass. I feel like they should have done a much better job in the first 2 quarters of the game, establishing the run game. It wasn't like they were playing from behind the entire game or anything like that. They could have established the line of scrimmage. And what you do in those first 2 quarters pays off in the third and fourth quarters. We've talked about this in Michigan football all the time when they've been at their best, and I think it applies to the Lions as well. Those 3-4 yard gains that you get in the first 2 quarters end up being 8-9 yard gains by the second half. You wear down another team's front seven. It didn't seem like the Lions really had a whole lot of interest in doing that with the fact that you had Jared Goff throwing the ball 55 times. I mean, I like Goff. I think Goff is a very good quarterback. I think at his best, he's a top 10 quarterback, but the identity of this football team is not throwing the ball 55 times. The identity of this team is running the ball. And I think also we saw in the red zone that they kind of got away from that as well. I like Ben Johnson and I'll continue to. That was not his best called game. And now you give Tampa Bay credit. That's why this particular loss doesn't bother me as much, because I think that's a good team they played. And I think that people were so hell-bent on burying the Tampa Bay Bucks in life post Tom Brady. But I think Bowles has done a good job there. Baker Mayfield's totally turned his career around. They have weapons. They have receivers. They seem pretty well coached. Like I think that's a pretty good team. It wouldn't shock me if they see them again. But at the same time, I feel like over the last several years, this team has done a tremendous job of finishing drives, not just sustaining drives, but finishing drives, often with the run game. They got away from that on Sunday. And Goff also had 2 picks, one egregious one. He's had in back-to-back weeks interceptions on the good half of the 50, and he hasn't been able to capitalize on it. He's made bad throws at points. And it just seemed like he was short-arming. Again, it was offensively, the rhythm just doesn't seem like it's there. Now, there's so much talent here that at points they're able to make up for it, as we were able to see in the first game against Los Angeles. But it is crazy to me that given the number of times in which they've thrown the ball, Sam Laporta had 2 targets on Sunday. And I don't know if that's a matchup thing. I don't know if that's something where you just have to give the defense credit and tip your cap. But Laporta was a massive part of this offense a season ago. In fact, I think one of the moments where we realized this could be a team that doesn't just make the playoffs, but can make a run in the playoffs is when we realized this guy's potential. I think he has the ability to be a top 3 receiving tight end in this league. We know how good he is as a blocker as well. To get 2 targets the entire game, that's very surprising. Now, Amon-Ra with a better day. 11 catches, though it seemed like he was banged up. I didn't get any word on what the status is with him. Obviously, you hope the best for him. It'd be a huge loss if he's not able to be 100% the next week. Look, like I said, I think it was the little things, but there were improvements that I saw, mainly defensively. I mean, Hutchinson, there's not enough that you can say. The announcers were freaking out. The fans were freaking out. I'm sure the Buccaneers were freaking out. The guy was unguardable all day on Sunday. And as critical as I can be of Aaron Glenn's defenses, and the first half they did annoy me with a lot of chunk plays that they were giving up to Chris Godwin, they adjusted in the second half. They gave up 7 second half points. They should have won that game. They should have won that game with the defense playing the way that they played on Sunday. You kind of view it as a missed opportunity because of that. But it's very bizarre how in the last year, my perception of the Lions continually differs from other fans' perceptions of the Lions. Because last year they beat the Chiefs in week 1, right? And everyone was fired up. It's a great win. They come back and they lose to Seattle at home. And I remember thinking at the time, that's the most Lions shit ever. That's so the kind of loss that leads to a 3-game losing streak that derails the season before it ever gets off the ground. Now, they bounced back and they played great football, not just the next week, but the rest of the season. You hope now that they can find a similar bounce back. Now, last year to me proved that this is different. And because I believe this is different, I have full faith that they'll be able to make their adjustments, that they'll be able to finish drives, that Goff will play better. But unlike last year when that third game was against pretty average Falcons team, at least the quarterback play they weren't going to beat you with Desmond Ridder. You're now going up against a Cardinals team that is significantly more intriguing than I think a lot of people expected them to be. They played the Rams. Kind of ironic. The Lions just played the Rams and beat the Rams. They shit-pumped the Los Angeles Rams. Kyler Murray, Marvin Harrison Jr., that looks like a legit quarterback-wide receiver combo. They scored 41 points. They have some athletes. It seems like Jonathan Gannon's kind of doing some good things there. You are playing on the road. That's that's a toss-up game, and that's a big game. I said it from the beginning that the Lions are going to be getting every team's best shot. I think the first 2 games of this season are reflective of that. But this is going to be, I think, a huge game in terms of momentum and just how we feel about the rest of the season. Because we are still kind of living in that sheen of last year's success. Hey, it's going to work out. Goff is going to figure it out. The defense is going to be fine. If next week we see the same version of Goff, and we see the same inconsistent play calling, at that point, my opinion starts to change a little bit. We start to get a little bit more concerned because this is a 1-1 football team. And while, look, they were a few plays away from being 2-0, they're also a few plays away from easily being 0-2. I mean, it kind of took a miracle to win game one. They had multiple chances to put the ball in the end zone late against Tampa Bay and couldn't convert. In fact, they made a horrible play call on a 3rd and 6 that basically gifted the Lions a free timeout. And they just weren't able to finish. I guess my overall kind of thesis here is that there was nothing that I saw on Sunday that I felt like was a big enough issue that can't be cleaned up with one solid week of practice. Like Goff turned the ball over is an issue, throwing the picks. I think he can clean that up. Play calling can be cleaned up. I think it's just the little things. And if you can't do the little things in an NFL game, regardless of your opponent, you're often going to end up losing. The Buccaneers were just a more sound, fundamental team, I felt like, on Sunday. And it's a big reason why they won that game. It's a big reason why they're 2-0. But right now, my stance on the Lions is relax. I think that this can get figured out. I think this roster is too talented. I think they're going to be fine, but how I feel may change depending on how they perform next week. I think they have a very close game against Arizona, but I do think they win next week. I think they beat the Cardinals. Even though Los Angeles played a neck-and-neck game with Detroit, and you could argue should have beaten Detroit, they've gotten injuries already piling up. I mean, Puka being out like 5 to 7 weeks is huge for them. They are a team with several aging pieces. I mean, Stafford, as great as he is, he's in his late 30s at this point. Even a guy like Cooper Kupp, who's amazing and played incredible in that first game against Detroit, he's had some injury issues. So, I don't know. And maybe that's a team where their season could derail before it really gets started, even though I think their roster is pretty good. Whereas Arizona, you have a young group. You have a quarterback that finally seems like he has some weapons to play with. They're gonna have to play a good game, but I trust the coaching staff here, which is something that I've rarely said throughout my lifetime as a Detroit Lions fan. So onward forth, we're going to talk about the college teams in this state. I'm actually going to start with MSU just because there's very little to talk about. It's Prairie View A&M. I'm not knocking them for scheduling them. I have no issue with preseason tune-up cupcake games. That's all fine and dandy. Right now, through 3 games, Jonathan Smith's team has checked off all the boxes and then some. They've forced turnovers defensively. They've been explosive from an offensive standpoint. They've run the ball really well. It's very clear that they are putting a focus on returning to their identity as a football program. The offensive lines look better. Childs has been erratic at points, but we know the ceiling is high. The arm strength is there. The mobility is there. It's hard for me to take a lot out of the game they just played because they were playing a vastly inferior opponent that they steamrolled, and they should have steamrolled. I mean, if there's any good, I guess it's that, we would have been very concerned if that would have been a 14-7 game at halftime. But no, they took care of business. Now is the big step. Now, Boston College lost to Missouri, so they're no longer in the top 25. But they were in the top 25 as of a week ago. 3 years back, Michigan State, I believe in their second or third game of the season, went to Coral Gables and played Miami. And while that was not a great Miami team, it was, it's a legitimate opponent playing on the road in what at the time was year 2 of Mel Tucker's regime. They won that game and ultimately went 11-2. That was kind of the moment where people were like, okay, not only is this Kenneth Walker guy ridiculously good, this state team might have something. They might actually be playing for something. They might be better than we expect. So far, I think Michigan State's done a wonderful job. I think the Maryland game was a real surprise. They're 3-0. If you win this game at Boston College on Saturday, it greatly changes people's perception of your team going forward. In fact, it wouldn't even shock me if they end up in the top 25 if they win that game. It is a night game. It's on the road. I believe it's the red bandana game for Boston College, which for people who don't know the importance of that, I recommend you look that up. That's obviously always an emotional game for them. They have a brutal, brutal stretch after Boston College. And regardless of whether or not they win that game on Saturday, I feel like they are going to come back down to earth at some point. After Boston College, you got at home against Ohio State, at Oregon, at home against Iowa, which you never know what you're going to expect there, but they always have a great defense. At Michigan, we'll talk about them in a second. Indiana, who right now looks like they're not going to be a cakewalk. At Illinois, Bielema's done some good stuff there. Purdue at home, and then obviously you finish at home against Rutgers. So it does get easier in the last month. But yeah, the perception of this team can change with a big win on Saturday at Boston College. That's really all I have to say. So right now, as far as I'm concerned, nothing to really be concerned about with Michigan State football. A team that does have some things to be concerned about is Michigan football. And there's a part of me that feels like I'm being too pessimistic here. There's a part of me that feels like I'm being too judgy because last year's team, of course, that's the bar, that's the precedent that all Michigan football teams will now have to be living up to, and they were experienced and they were disciplined. So I'm trying to, at points, and it's difficult to do, I'm trying to, at points, remove myself from that and just judge this team and this coaching staff and these players as their own entity. And even when I do that, I still think there's major concerns with this football team. Maybe it's hyperbole on my part. This looks like a 5-6 loss football team right now. Now, there were improvements and things I saw on Saturday that did give me some hope. Look, one thing that we got to understand here as well, there was a lot of depth of last year's team, and there was. Offensively, when you look at that O-line, there's a lot to replace. And over the last several years, not only did you have an experienced offensive line, but you had an offensive line that had played together for years. That really does matter. Now, even though you might have a few guys here and there who've played, this line as a unit has not played together extensively over an entire season. The reason I say that is because that's the unit that I feel like will improve the most over time this season. Michigan always does a good job of developing an offensive line, so I'm not super concerned about that. And we saw on Saturday, Michigan returning to their roots a little bit, running the football. Khalil Mullings with a huge game. Donovan Edwards with some good runs. That's you really like to see. And my hope is that the deeper we get into Big Ten season, Michigan can go back to retaining that identity as a smash mouth football team, because that has to be your identity, because you're sure as shit not going to find an identity as an air raid team. And it is unbelievable to me, that this issue, which I spotted, when was the national championship game last year? January 8th, which I spotted on January 9th. I'll be generous and say January 12th or 13th when JJ officially announced he was going pro. I said, there ain't a fucking quarterback on this roster. And I was confident in that. And I didn't feel good about Alex Orji. And I didn't really feel particularly good about Davis Warren. And look, I hear people bringing up the portal and that they should have been more active. The answer is yes, they should have. I will cut them a fair amount of slack because people are quick to forget. For about a month, Michigan didn't know who their coach was going to be. Harbaugh decided to go to the NFL at a point where a lot of guys had already announced where they were going to be transferring to. So, yeah, and again, I don't know the timeline. Maybe a guy like a Cam Ward wasn't available at that point. Harbaugh did leave things up in the air for the program. Wouldn't have it any other way. It ended up with a national championship. With that said, any quarterback in the portal, any random solid MAC level quarterback would be an improvement over what they have on this roster right now. And I know that's harsh, but I've talked about it before, the Michigan football tier list. We need to accept that there is not, I laugh even mentioning this. There is not a J.J. McCarthy here, okay? J.J. McCarthy ain't walking through that door, okay? They got to figure things out. But I still think this team could find relative success in the Big Ten with a Cade McNamara style attack, which is, hey, manage the game, don't turn the ball over, don't take dumb sacks. The offensive line and the running backs will carry you. Be a game manager. That's a very roundabout way of saying they need a quarterback to manage the game. If they had that, I would probably be feeling better about this team. If they had what Jake Rudock was the first half of 2015 or what Cade was in 2021. But they have quarterbacks who are either, Alex Orji's case, insanely inaccurate, or in the case of Davis Warren, reckless. He threw 3 picks against Arkansas State. And this was a game to me, and that's why I kind of glossed over what Michigan State did on Saturday, because to me, that's a game, you put those games on your schedule as confidence boosters. Look, playing Texas week 2, that's tough. It would have been tough for last year's Michigan team. It was even tougher for this year's Michigan team. As frustrating of a loss as it was, and while I did notice some real issues, I felt like they had an opportunity to get right. And by the time the kickoff came on Saturday, there was a part of me that's like, maybe I've just been too harsh. Maybe Texas is just that good. Maybe things are going to be fine. Maybe Davis Warren gets going, and every single bleeping time it seemed like the offense or the passing game was getting going, he would throw an interception. And these weren't just like off the receiver's hands, tipped up in the air, picked off. I mean, these were egregious, where the fuck are you looking interceptions, just the kind of stuff that derails drives. And you know what? As frustrated as I am with the quarterback play, and as frustrated as I am by the coaching staff of not understanding the importance of the quarterback position, which sounds like an insane thing to say in 2024, there are other problems with this team. Last year's team, and okay, forget last year, last 3 years, right? The Mike McDonald / Jesse Minter era of defense at Michigan. The discipline was astounding. These guys never got called for penalties. And if they got called for penalties, they weren't stupid penalties. They weren't roughing the passer. They weren't late hits. They weren't face masks or targeting. It was, okay, maybe an occasional PI here or there, maybe an occasional offsides here, but for the most part, I mean, it was, they were locked up tight. They on Saturday had a defense that should have ended multiple drives and ended up extending drives for the other team because of dumb penalties, roughing the passer, late hits out of bounds. You know, I know we're 3 games in, but in my experience, that's one of the top signs of a poorly coached team. There is no excuse because there's talent here, but this team is not talented enough to have to beat themselves. Just focus on beating the opponent that you're playing. And I feel like on Saturday, with the way they played, if you were playing a more quality Big Ten opponent, you might not have won. No? And I understand those last 2 drives where they gave up points were second string defense. I understand that, but there's more to it than that. You know, they didn't really establish much in the second half. I do feel like they got the ground game going a little bit, which is good. But right now I'm getting, I can't believe I'm saying this, like a lesser version of 2017 vibes. Now, 2017 was the John O'Corn year, but at least that team did have a really good defense. That was before Don Brown got completely exposed. And that team had a really solid running attack with Higdon and Chris Evans. They did end up winning 8 games. They just lost the only games that mattered. The Big Ten is a lot tougher now. And because of that, it doesn't get any easier. USC is an unfamiliar opponent, right? This is the first time that Michigan and USC have played each other since they joined the Big Ten. But I mean, I'm not feeling great about it. I hate to be sky is falling down with this, but I got to be realistic. I'm not going to come on here and just act like things are going to somehow get fixed because of what a team last year did or what a team 2 years ago did. This is its own group. And what has me concerned is that I have seen Michigan football teams that were very well coached in the past, and I've seen Michigan football teams that weren't very well coached in the past. And as I said in my post-game video on Saturday, to me, one of the number one signs that a coaching staff knows what they're doing is that they have the ability to take their best athletes and turn them into stars, right? That concerns me because this defense, while not bad through 3 games, I feel like still has a significant amount of talent. And I feel like they should be playing significantly better. You shouldn't be giving up 18 points against, or whatever it was, against Arkansas. I think it was 18. Texas, you got gashed. And, well, I've heard Will Johnson's name a lot. Did Mason Graham play on Saturday? I mean, we're talking about a guy who was the defensive MVP of the Rose Bowl last year, had a monster season. Where are these guys? You know, and maybe there's something that the other teams are doing schematically that's taking these guys out of the game. But never had that problem with Hutch. No, never had that problem with Ajabo or Saint Still. That's a bit concerning. Here's the one thing. This will be my last point about the college football teams in the state. We're 3 games in, and I can't believe I'm saying this. Right now, subject to change, we got another month plus. If Michigan and Michigan State played each other, I would pick Michigan State to win. Even though it's in the Big House, like, you cannot win games with a quarterback who's going to be turning the ball over 2 or 3 times. Now, again, subject to change, Michigan's going to play better. In my heart of hearts, I do think the chance of Michigan State being this good and Michigan being this subpar are low. That something's going to happen, that water will find its level, that even a microcosm of the Michigan team that we thought we'd see will show up at some point this season. But they better hurry up, because it's not getting any easier. And I would argue they've played 3 games, and in not a single one of those have they looked like the team that we expected them to be. I don't know who's starting at quarterback on Saturday. My one recommendation is whoever it is, stick with them. You know, because Orji threw a touchdown on a 2-yard pass. He also missed a wide open. It's a mess. That position is a mess. And right now, I'm not going to call the entire season a wash. You still got to play the games, but your priority the second the Ohio State game ends this year is who's your quarterback for next season, because it ain't any one of these guys on the roster, unless you want to go Jaden Davis. But even then, I feel like you'd be better off going to the portal. All right, let's talk about a team that's a lot more successful lately, and that is the Detroit Tigers, who took a series against Baltimore. They won multiple series this week. They went 4-2 in the homestand. They went 2-1 against the Rockies, 2-1 against a really good Orioles team, helping out the New York Yankees in the process. So you're welcome, Yankees fans. They are now 2.5 games back of that last wild card. They are keeping pace. They've had some missed opportunities, right? Like, it sucks because you go 4-2 on a homestand throughout a year, like you're going to win a ton of games, but you got to play some catch up. You got to start sweeping a few series. Left some runs on the board against Colorado. Had a rally going on Saturday against Baltimore and couldn't finish the job. But as a whole, look, they're playing really well. And again, I don't know how this ends, and I want playoffs. And really, man, the second half 2024 Detroit Tigers have looked like a playoff team. The problem is there's another 81 games that you got to play in which, they didn't look like one. You are seeing a core coming together, and that's very exciting. But the number one thing that people are talking about that is now getting national attention, because we've known for 4 years that this coaching staff seems like they know what they're doing with these pitchers, and they have. And I went back to it like, we talked about it with Mize and Manning and Skubal in 21 when they were coming up. But like, I just remember noticing, what you were getting from like Jose Cisnero and Alex Lang and like fucking Willie Peralta was pitching really good baseball for you. And it seemed like they were just doing an excellent job of taking guys that you didn't think a whole lot of and having them pitch some pretty darn good innings for you. And what we've seen in the second half of this season is, what's the opposite of coaching malpractice? Like coaching excellence, because that's what we've seen in the second half with these pitchers. On Friday, they threw a one-hitter. They lost a no-hitter with 2 outs in the 9th, and you had Brant Herter out there looking like prime Kershaw. I mean, just getting ahead in every count 0-2. I've mentioned it a million times, but having the physical gifts and having the stuff is one thing. When you have a young pitching staff, which a lot of these guys are, Montero, Herter, Hannafy, a lot of these guys haven't even pitched in the big leagues before. In some instances, if they have, it's been a really long time. You got to instill that confidence that these guys know what they're doing. And you get the impression, regardless of how things go, every single pitcher on this staff comes into an outing completely prepared. They know who they're facing. They know what their role is going to be. And that is carried over. I remember when I talked to Tarek Skubal before the season saying that I hoped Detroit becomes that kind of pitching factory that a lot of teams want to be a part of, or a lot of players want to be a part of. And he said he feels like they're already there. Well, you know what? Tarek was right. And I'm going to listen to the guy who's probably going to win the American League Cy Young. What Chris Fetter and Robin Lund have done with this staff has been amazing. And you saw it against Baltimore. I mean, Baltimore had one big inning against Kenta Maeda. Besides that, their butts were shut down that entire series. A good lineup. I know Vest gave up the 2-run home run, but they were just in cruise control the entire time. You had Cater Montero against Colorado throwing a complete game shutout with under 100 pitches. That part of this team is not going away. And that has me incredibly excited, because not only is there talent, there's so much depth here. I mean, we haven't seen Jackson Jobe yet. We haven't even really seen what Ty Madden's going to be capable of yet. I mean, I think Cater Montero's turned himself into a major league pitcher. Is he going to be part of the 5-man rotation next year? I don't know. Regardless of how things go over the next calendar year or so, I'm confident a whole lot of lineups are not going to want to come to Comerica Park, because facing that pitching staff is going to be brutal. Now, offensively, they've gotten going a little bit. Riley Green's had a huge September. Parker Meadows has turned things around. But as far as where this team stands, because we could talk about individual performances and shit like that, let's get down to brass tacks. You want to know if they're going to make the playoffs. The expanded postseason has kind of changed my opinion on some of this stuff, because to me, as frustrating as it is to lose a game and then you see the Twins lose and you say, oh, goddamn, we could have gained a game on them. You play 162 for a reason. And those first 81 matter just as much as the second 81. And this team was not a quality opponent in the first half of the season. The pitching wise, they were fine, but the amount of games offensively. I mean, you guys remember how long it took Reese Olson to get a win? You remember how long it took Jack Flaherty to get a win? I mean, the offense was giving them nothing. Now, what they are today, it's a night and day difference, and it's fun to watch, and it's exciting, and it makes you feel good about the future. If they want to make the playoffs, they are going to have to pull a miracle. Now, what I mean by that is not making up 2.5 games over the span of 2 weeks. That's doable. What I mean is there's going to have to be a game where they're down and out, where they pull one out of their ass. Now, they almost did it on Saturday. They were down 4-0. Corbin Burns was brilliant. They almost pulled that one out. They had a rally going in the ninth. You now have a series coming up against Kansas City. Kansas City has played you tough, and Kansas City has been one of the few teams that's hit your pitchers, at least somewhat. They've hit Scooble. They're playing for something. They're going to be in the postseason. Between that and the Baltimore series, I think you gotta sweep one of them. I know that's crazy, but I have a hard time believing they win both series, which means that going 500 is kind of a wash at this point in the season. You got to make up ground. It's a tough order, obviously, but that's it's the result of the way the standings are at right now. There's not a whole lot you can do about it. I'm not saying that they're playing with house money, because if they miss the postseason, I'll be disappointed. But the fact is, I wanted to see a good baseball team this year playing meaningful baseball, and they've done that. And I understand. I understand there's going to be a lot of people who are going to come away from this and say, shit, dude, it's been 10 years since they made the playoffs. Like, you're really going to put a feather in their cap just because they played meaningful baseball. Those people turned off the TV when Kristen Stewart was batting cleanup. Okay. I have seen worse here. We've seen worse this season. There's a lot of steps that still need to be taken. But Baltimore's a good team, and they outplayed Baltimore that series. They've played some good teams and won, and that's very encouraging. So that will do it for today's I'll Say This. I guess I didn't really give my predictions about next week's football games. I did say I think the Lions win. I think Michigan and Michigan State both lose. I think Michigan State has rarely had the ability to have their weaknesses shine through. I think we see that on Saturday, and Michigan, I just don't think I don't think they have a quarterback. So I'm not going to pick them against teams that do. Really. That's football season. So you can follow me on Twitter at Castellani2014. You can find this show on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. Let's get those watch hours up. Shout out to Austin Sisler, continuing to make me look good, or as good as I can look. We have more Chris and Company coming this week, an interview with Noah Fisher of the Party Animals. If people are not familiar with them, they're in the league as the same league as the Savannah Bananas, so you can look forward to that interview. Yeah, we are we're trying. Maybe I'm misguided with my efforts, but I want to it's tough going back to square one, but the alternative is giving up, and I'm not going to do that. So thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in. I will see y'all next week. Stay tuned for more Chris and Company. Follow me on social media platforms. Have a good one. Peace and happiness.